Here's Brian Holdsworth to ask a question that atheists can easily answer.
Okay, obviously, atheists come in all shapes and sizes, and inevitably, whenever I offer any kind of argument about atheism or against atheism, people will say, not all atheists believe that. Not all atheists believe the same thing. That's a straw man argument. And that's true, not all atheists believe the same thing. But a 10-minute YouTube video doesn't allow me to address every variation of atheism that exists. Nor is it my goal to refute every instance of that common creed. Instead, I'm simply trying to address people who subscribe to a popular form of atheism, especially a kind that I interact with a lot on YouTube and that I see on certain channels, and to invite them to reconsider the logical coherence of their position. And if what I describe doesn't align with your particular form of atheism, then you can be confident that I'm not addressing you, and then therefore there's no need to be defensive. So the particular kind of atheism that I'm addressing in this video is the kind that says that only what can be materially observed and empirically measured is real, and that if you want to assert anything as true, that is the kind of evidence that you need to provide.
The idea that only things that can be materially observed and empirically measured are real is not only an idea that not all atheists assert, it's an idea that I've never heard any atheist assert. So it still looks an awful lot like a straw man to me. Perhaps Brian is conflating a kind of Russell's teapot argument that if we can't empirically demonstrate something, there's no point in believing in it. But saying that there's no point in believing in something is not the same thing as saying that it isn't real. There could be lots of things that exist and are real despite the fact that we have no good reason to believe in them.
And it's on those kinds of grounds that they accuse religious believers of being superstitious for not being able to provide empirical evidence for our religious claims. So it's this kind of atheist that I address this question to, because I just don't think that they can answer it. I've done a lot of searching myself to see, are there atheists out there? Are there commentators? Are there even scholars who answer this? And I don't seem to be able to find one that is satisfying.
The word satisfying is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. It makes it very tempting to believe that Brian would only be satisfied with an answer that is predicated upon the existence of a god. Insofar as that is the case, I see no reason to care about whether or not he finds my responses satisfying.
The question is slavery wrong?
Yes, when I say that something is wrong, what I mean is that it results in my opposition. This, by the way, is easily empirically testable because if you present me with someone who is enslaved, I will try to help them escape that slavery, and I will report the person doing the enslaving to whatever authority I believe will stop them from enslaving anyone else.
And the reason I ask that question is because virtually all respectable people will frantically trip over themselves to be the first to affirm that, yeah, it's wrong. Slavery is definitely wrong.
Yes, slavery definitely results in me opposing it.
And I even hear many atheists accuse the Bible of being morally inferior for not going far enough in its condemnations of slavery.
The Bible definitely does not oppose slavery as much as I do.
But I don't think that the atheists of the variety that I described earlier can answer this question sufficiently. By that, I don't mean that they don't have answers, just that their answers are illogical and that they expose an inconsistency in the kinds of evidence that they demand of others to account for their beliefs. Because if you're going to logically account for the truth of a statement like slavery is wrong, you have to be able to define the terms of that statement.
Which I did, by the way. When I say that something is morally wrong, what I mean is that such a thing results in me reacting to that thing in such a way as to oppose it, by which I mean that I will try to obstruct, stop, or prevent it.
Slavery is easy enough to define, so I'm not going to spend any time on that. But the word wrong is one that I've never heard defined in a way that is consistent with atheism.
Well, you're in luck if you see this video because I just gave such a definition.
Because if you're going to define something logically, you cannot include the thing that you're trying to define in your definition.
Yeah, you can. In fact, you have to, otherwise you're talking about something else.
That would be circular reasoning and therefore fallacious.
Well, no, it wouldn't be circular reasoning because definitions are not a form of reasoning. They're not arguments. They're not inferences. Definitions are just different words that mean the same thing. If you ask me what the word large means, and I say it means big, a word that means the exact same thing, that is a perfectly legitimate definition.
For example, if I asked you, what is a honeybee? And you said, well, it's a bee-like creature that makes honey. I would be fully within my rights to accuse you of failing to answer my question.
No, you wouldn't. The only way that wouldn't answer your question is if you didn't know what the word honey or the word bee meant. In that case, your question should have been, what is honey and what is a bee?
All you said is that a bee is a bee.
No, it isn't. That would only be the case if the concept of making honey were inherent to the concept of being a bee. It's not, because not all bees make honey.
And that's obvious enough. But what's also true is that we can't use undefined synonyms in our definitions of a thing either.
I'm not sure what you mean by undefined synonyms. If I say that the definition of the word bachelor is an unmarried male, then I'm defining it by giving a synonymous term. The term unmarried male is synonymous with bachelor. Is that definition illegitimate somehow if I don't then define what the term unmarried male means?
So if you ask me, what is a cat? And I said, well, a cat is a feline creature that humans have a disordered amount of affection for. Well, feline is just a synonym for cat. So all I've said, again, is a cat, which does nothing to define what it is. It just keeps us going in circles.
That's only a problem if you don't know what feline means. Defining words using synonyms is perfectly fine as long as you know what the synonym means. The Google definition of the word large says of considerable or relatively great size, extent, or capacity. The word great in this context is simply a synonym for large.
And unfortunately, every time I've heard an atheist give an account for morality, which then allows them to use words like right and wrong logically and coherently, this is the exact thing that they do. Like one article I read said that morality is simply whatever prevents suffering and increases well-being. But all they've done, according to this definition, is made suffering synonymous with evil and well-being synonymous with goodness, never really defining any of them.
I don't use that definition of morality myself, but I don't see why that's not an adequate definition. The only way that definition would leave you still wondering what the author of that article means by morality is if you don't understand what suffering and well-being mean. I'm pretty sure Brian does understand what those words mean, and his real problem is not that the definition he cites doesn't really define what the author of the article in question means by morality. I don't think Brian is really looking for a definition of morality. Rather, he's looking for a justification for why suffering is equated to evil and well-being is equated with good. He's looking for an argument rather than a definition.
And furthermore, they're not even accurate synonyms. Suffering isn't simply wrong or evil. In fact, I can think of all kinds of instances in which varying degrees of suffering can produce something that is widely considered good, such as like chemotherapy or surgery.
Chemotherapy and surgery are not suffering. They are causes of suffering, not examples of suffering. It's not the suffering that these treatments cause that result in the desired outcomes.
Exercise is almost universally recognized as a good thing in the right place and at the right time. But the first time I went running as a way to get back in shape, the experience was so unpleasant for me that I nearly threw up. Self-sacrifice and self-denial seem to me to be traits that most people recognize as being honorable, but almost always introduce a degree of suffering. We have monuments in virtually every city where I live commemorating those who died in the wars of the 20th century. So was it wrong for them to suffer and die for those causes?
Again, these are things that result in suffering. They are not suffering per se. I suspect that the author that Brian cites, who said that morality is that which decreases suffering and increases well-being, was probably a utilitarian who meant the net level of suffering and the net level of well-being. These examples Brian gives of causes of suffering result in a net reduction of suffering and a net increase in well-being, which on the utilitarian account still make them good things. He doesn't give exact quotes, so it's hard to discern what the author actually meant and hard to evaluate whether Brian is giving an accurate portrayal of their views.
So it seems that not only is morality and right and wrong not defined by that definition, the synonyms that they attempt to smuggle in as substitutes for the terms that they are trying to define in a circular way aren't even good synonyms. Many others have tried to argue that morality is simply what has been agreed upon as a social contract, which can accumulate into something like a legal system or the law. But this begs for a definition of the social contract or the law. If you reply that the social contract is an agreement about what is right and wrong, then all you've done is made the social contract or the law synonymous with morality.
Which, again, is a perfectly legitimate way to define something. And again, it looks like Brian is not really seeking a definition of morality, but rather an argument which justifies an atheist moral system.
And again, you're back to arguing in circles.
See what I mean? He's confusing definitions with arguments. He's asking for a definition of morality, but what he's really looking for is an argument that justifies an atheist conception of morality.
If I ask you what is morality, and you say that it's the social contract about what is right and wrong, or the law, and I follow up by asking, okay, can you define what the law is? And you say it's a series of documented statements about what is right and wrong. Do you not see how we're just going in circles without ever defining any of the things that we're talking about?
I've never heard anyone give any such definition of the law. PhilosophyTube just did a video about how nobody's really nailed down a precise definition of the word law.
Furthermore, it fails to account how we can judge one instance of a social contract or a legal system against another. How can we say that the legal system that allows slavery are bad and the legal systems that prevent it are good unless morality somehow sits outside and above legal systems and social contracts? Because that's the question that's being asked here. Is slavery wrong? Are systems that allow slavery wrong?
Yes, they elicit opposition from me. That's what I mean when I say that they are wrong.
And the reason we always end up with these absurdities is because morality can't be accounted for empirically without obscuring it behind some poorly assessed substitute, which is by definition circular reasoning.
Morality can be accounted for empirically. Accounting for it simply means explaining why it exists. You don't really want us to account for morality. You want us to justify morality. I don't believe that there can be any ultimate objective non-circular justification for morality, even if there is a God who dictates that morality. Even if there is a God who gives us moral prescriptions, what is the objective reason we ought to follow them? Is it because God says to? That sounds pretty circular to me. Is it because of some principle that ultimately is not based in God? If there is such a principle, then there can be at least one moral principle which does not depend on a God. How do you get around the Euthyphro dilemma?
And don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. I'm not saying that an atheist can't be moral or that they don't have a moral conscience. What I am saying is that they can't account for that morality logically. For them, it's something like social conditioning or just feelings about something.
Those would be perfectly logical accounts, by the way. Again, what Brian is looking for is not an account, but an ultimate justification.
But whatever it is, it's not rational. Now, at this point, it might be fair to demand of me the thing that I've been asking atheists for, which is, what's my definition of morality? So morality is a standard of truth that gives us the ability to apprehend potential alternative thoughts, actions, and scenarios, and to make judgments about them that express either approval or disapproval when compared to that standard. Such judgments appear in statements like, that ought to happen, and that ought not to happen.
Well, then there are plenty of moral systems that are not based in God which fit that definition. Utilitarianism takes net happiness as the standard. Deontological ethics takes the categorical imperative as the standard.
Or more precisely, that ought to be and that ought not to be. In other words, we are making judgments of an ontological and metaphysical nature, which are inquiries about being and existence.
Moral questions are not ontological questions. Ontological questions are questions about what it means for something to exist, or what is the nature of something's existence, or of existence itself. These are totally distinct questions from the question of whether something ought to exist.
These aren't questions about what does happen, they're questions about what ought to happen.
And they're not questions about what exists or what it means for something to exist, which they would have to be in order to be ontological questions.
Because what ought to happen doesn't always happen. For example, slavery happens and is happening right now in the world around us. And if we say that's wrong, we're saying it ought not to happen.
I'm not. When I say that it's wrong, I'm saying that I will obstruct it whenever I'm given the opportunity to do so. I don't think there is any ultimate non-circular justification for any prescription, again, even even if there is a God.
But if we only take our moral understanding from that which can be observed and measured empirically, then there is no question of what ought to be, only what is, because only what is what can be measured and inquired about in this way.
Which is exactly why there are no ultimate oughts that can be objectively justified in a non-circular way.
Which is why the physical sciences can't tell us that slavery is wrong. They can only tell us that it is.
The empirical sciences can absolutely tell you it's wrong by the way I define wrong. When I say something is wrong, I mean that I will behave in such a way as to oppose it. You can empirically test this by observing my behavior.
It exists. It has being. But if you're saying it ought not to exist, then you're appealing to some invisible standard that can't be measured empirically.
That's why I don't say that anything ultimately ought not exist. I say slavery is wrong, by which I mean I cannot tolerate it, but I don't think that saying it ought not exist has any objective meaning. Even if you believe that it ought not exist because God says so, which he doesn't, by the way, that is still circular because the answer to the question, why ought we do what God says, will in one way or another amount to because God says so.
That is used to judge potentials like slavery or not slavery, and saying that one should be willed and that the other should be opposed. One of those potentials, that is not slavery, should be instantiated by our will, and the other should be left on the shelf of mere potentials. And to make such statements, you have to offer evidence of a metaphysical and a theological nature, because there is no physical evidence available to you.
Again, evidence of a metaphysical or theological nature still can't justify ought statements. Even if there is a God, and even if it is a fact that God makes prescriptions, it simply does not follow that anyone therefore ought to obey them. This is not a logical inference. Also, if moral statements are contingent upon potential states of affairs, you can't say that I ought to oppose gay marriage, for example, because my conscience won't allow me to do that. I'm psychologically incapable of that. It is not a potential state of affairs.
Which is why it's no wonder that slavery, which virtually disappeared in Christendom in the Middle Ages, started to resurge in Western civilization at exactly the time when secularism started to gain momentum and influence.
Do you know what a post hoc fallacy is? I could understand this inference if there weren't so many religious folks who enslaved people. I haven't run the numbers, but I'm pretty confident that atheists were a minority among antebellum plantation owners.
That is, the modern era. The slave trade that we tend to think of and universally condemn really only got going during the scientific, secular, and Enlightenment era. In the ancient world, slavery abounded everywhere. The Roman Empire was built on the backs of slaves. And then in the Middle Ages, it went into severe decline, and in certain places where Christianity was dominant and the church was most influential, it virtually disappeared. But then for some reason, around the time of humanism, and then the Renaissance, and then the Enlightenment, it came back.
That some reason, by the way, is colonialism, which happened to coincide with the Enlightenment. Colonialism caused the uptick in enslavement, not the Enlightenment.
It was exactly at this time when we stopped measuring the human soul as an essential ingredient in a person's humanity and reduced that inquiry about what a human being is to only what can be physically measured, only what the sciences can tell us. And when they did that, they found that human beings are far from being equal. Some are bigger, some are stronger, some are smarter, some are more beautiful, some are more agreeable, and more capable than others. Combine this with theories about natural selection and survival of the fittest, and you have the perfect recipe to say some people should dominate others, and some people should be utterly subservient to others.
The phrase survival of the fittest was coined by Herbert Spencer in 1864, the year before slavery was abolished in the U.S., and was based on Darwin's ideas in The Origin of Species, which was published just 5 years prior to that. It's pretty hard to pin any responsibility for slavery on this idea, given that it appeared just as the U.S. was about to fight a war to abolish it, and decades after Britain had already abolished it.
It is only when we account for the human soul, a thing more precious than the entire known universe, that we can then say that all men are equal, for they all carry the dignity of the divine image imprinted on that soul. And this is why it is an injustice to place a thing greater than the whole universe in service of cultivating the small contingent goods of that universe for another person.
If you believe that we ought not enslave people because the value of the human soul is greater than the whole universe, then why does the Bible countenance slavery so much? Why does it explicitly give permission to own enslaved people? Why does Leviticus 25:44 say, "Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves"? Why may you buy enslaved people if slavery is an affront to the value of the human soul? To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.